in this phase. And if you look at this, this is akin to the physical phase, this is akin to the vital phase, and then there's a third phase that I'd call conceptual or purpose-driven, in which an organization gets much higher degrees of freedom, in that now it's not even constrained by its financial goals, but it's some kind of deeper purpose that may drive it, and that gives it a lot more freedom to do what it wants. And I'd refer to that as the mental phase. So we see again that for an organization to be continually successful, to innovate successively, it has to again display this pattern that we saw here, that defines the playing field that we're in. And then I'll make one more comparison, dropping down another level to the level of an individual or person. And here, as we consider this, we see that, for example, suppose a person has an emotion such as boredom, and they're kind of, as a result of that, they're in a state of lethargy, they can't really move around. To get out of that, they may exercise something, a different kind of emotion, say like anger. But that may give them freedom to move out of it, but it doesn't give them freedom because they're still locked into a certain way of being. And then in order to really get out of that phase, they may have to apply reason or the light of the mind to overcome these emotions that are really constraining the way that they may behave. So there's reason. And when we look at this, again, we see the same kind of pattern, physical, vital to mental. And so we see that this pattern existing on many different scales. And quite frankly, here, I've just considered a few different situations, but I've written a book called Connecting Inner Power with Global Change. And this was published by Sage a couple of years ago. And in this, there are many, many more examples of this pattern that exists that animates our playing field. Now the question is, if the system in which we exist has this pattern at so many different levels, what does that really tell us about the system? And this is what brings us to now the focus on a number of talks that will emerge from here. But the real question is, what arises, what are some of the principles, what are some of the properties that we can derive from observing this kind of behavior? And number one, I'd say that as we try and make sense of the system itself, so forget about this behavior here, I'll come back to this later, but as we try and make sense of the system itself, the very fact that we have this pattern that repeats itself on a more and more complex scale, right up to the macro level, defining the upper boundary of our playing field, means that there's some kind of intelligence or wisdom or knowledge that's prevalent in the system. And I'll be more specific. The very fact that we have the same pattern evolving the way it does means that there is this knowledge, wisdom kind of principle that allows or that shifts circumstance so that the progression of that circumstance is happening in a certain pattern. And this is totally, in a sense, predictable, or we know that it's going to happen no matter where it is. Now the second quality that we might see emerge is that if we consider the reality of say, the physical or vital stage, no matter where it is, there's always a bias or there's a strong force to maintain that status no matter what. And what's happening is that the system is moving beyond that bias or strong resistance, even though that strong resistance exists. So that means that the system has to have a lot of inherent power in order to exercise this change that's happening. So not only is there's this knowledge, wisdom, but there's a kind of a power aspect to the system that no matter how strong resistance might be, we still find the progress happening that's dictated by this pattern of progress. Third, this pattern is happening everywhere. It's not just happening in one place or in one industry or in one market or one part of the world. The reality is that when we look deep enough and far enough, we'll find this pattern existing everywhere. So there's kind of a omnipresent aspect to it, a container. It's almost as though the system we exist in is a container that serves the different constructs in it so that these constructs can develop in a certain way. So there's this notion of a omnipresent service almost that exists. And then the very fact that we could have all have remained, I mean, this is the pattern that could have prevailed, or this is the pattern, this is the status that could have prevailed, but the fact is that it hasn't, and we're shifting, means that there's some kind of incredible caring that's, or love almost, that exists in this system in which we exist. So we find four very distinct qualities or properties that in a sense become archetypes for any kind of organization, that if an organization is concerned about its development, if it taps into these four deeper kinds of principles that exist behind the apparent seeing of things, then it's tapping into this greater force that is pushing it towards a certain outcome. So there's this deeper principle or combination of principles, or four distinct principles that exist, which is present everywhere and which is pushing organizations to become something that embodies these four different things. Now, to get more practical, let's look at a few different organizations. So when we consider the organization of a human being, we'll find that we have each of these four principles that make up inherently what we are as human beings. So we have the knowledge-wisdom principle that manifests as mind. We have the power-leadership principle that manifests as the vital. We have the service-perfection principle that manifests as a physical being. And we have this caring love principle that manifests as the heart. And this is part of our essential makeup. It's not that this thing happened randomly. It's just that when we look at it from this point of view, is that this is a reflection or a pattern of a deeper inherent set of principles that animates the system. And everything that we create that's sustainable, that's going to last, has to, in some sense, embody these four different principles. And we'll go into the reason for this later. But when we think about the market today, or we think about the global economy, again, for a global economy to be totally sustainable, it has to have these four different principles. So there has to be this knowledge-wisdom principle, there has to be this power-leadership principle, this service-perfection principle, and this caring-love principle. And today, as a matter of fact, what we find is that we have just this power-leadership principle, and the other principles are very subservient to this. So what we have as a result is kind of the aggressive, vital way of being that's represented by this middle layer here. And the fact of the matter is that when we think about restructuring the global economy so that it becomes something that is totally sustainable, then we have to think about that reconstruction such that we are also tapping into these other deep principles that are an essential part of the system in which we live in.